Ban Dongwook possessed exceptional basketball skills. Partially because of these, the protagonist greatly admired him. After finishing the training, the man suggested they go home together. Captivated by Lee Do-hyun's appearance, he agreed to everything, having long regarded his best friend as his idol. Later on, while the dark-haired man was working a side job, the brunette initiated a conflict with another friend near the cash register. Despite clear attempts to defuse the argument, the man only exacerbated the situation. However, this time, he was not the main instigator of the quarrel. His interlocutor, angered by Dongwook, doused him with water and braced for a fight. The main character, observing everything, understood that his friend would no longer hold back. He hurried to stop him before a scuffle could start. Knowing that the brunette was stronger than the opponent, and thus the latter could be seriously injured. Nevertheless, the man was so enraged that he could barely stay still, especially after his friend suddenly insulted him because of his friendship with him. Do-hyun did not know how to prevent the fight now, as he himself was horrified by what he had heard. Soon, as the situation escalated and the brunette planned to strike his opponent, the blue-eyed man intervened, putting himself in the line of fire. This shocked his best friend, who had not intended to strike a close person. The next moment, the man became indifferent to his friend's fate, and thus he sent him away, deciding to focus on the young man's well-being. Although the main character tried to convince everyone that he was all right, an expedition that the humans would later call kicking the hornet's nest. Therefore, Dongwook did not believe him and decided to check the injury himself. At that moment, as the young man tried to refuse such care, a familiar blonde appeared behind him. Yang Seungju was displeased with the beating of the dark-haired man. Upon accessing the data chip, we learned what happened. The next moment, he began to scold the brunette for his actions, believing that such a fragile person as the main character should not be harmed. Despite everything said, the man ignored the acquaintance, and even wanted to leave, telling his friend that they should spend the upcoming weekend together. This desolate place was so very different from the cool, humid forests we call home. As soon as he left, Seungju suggested to the blue-eyed man that they should cease their association with him. He believed that a friend with such a volatile temperament simply could not be good, and thus any ties with him should be severed. Despite the acquaintance's advice, the protagonist attempted to explain that the brunette was indeed a good person. Given the circumstances, he was unsuccessful. During further communication between the friends, the blonde ordered his favorite coffee and asked if he could have it for free, but regrettably, Do-hyun had to deny the request. Despite such a response, it seemed that Seungju was not at all upset. Almost immediately, the admiral ordered that the life pods be manned, each holding a copy of everything that had transpired since they entered the city. Over 300 pods were launched. 18 Chuthin years later, only one returned intact. Being an extremely popular man at the university, the brunette still could not sleep without his best friend beside him. Naturally, this seemed abnormal. Nevertheless, the dark-haired man confessed that it had always been this way. During further conversation, the blonde mentioned that one day Dongwook would need to start a family, and therefore it was advisable to break the bad habit. It was destroyed just after crossing our border and into what we believe to have been wild. It was destroyed when a fleet of warships of unknown affiliation appeared. No, not jumped in from hyperspace. They simply were there. The first thing they did was broadcast a message over every known channel in Senate space. The acquaintance genuinely offered Do-hyun a relationship with him, but he took it as a joke. The next moment, the brunette appeared before the young man with special patches for injuries. He decided to apologize in this way and thus helped apply them. The man remembered that besides the injury site, the dark-haired man was in pain elsewhere, and thus took care of that too. The protagonist was touched by the care of his beloved person and immediately thanked him. Only when the man left did the young man mentally admit that he had many reasons to love him, despite his fiery temper. After some time, Do-hyun came to stay overnight at his friend's house. The brunette's mother was delighted by the visit, though she secretly wished the guest were female, as her son could then have not just a close person, but a life partner. When the dark-haired man heard such remarks, he felt awkward, especially since he had long been in love with Dongwook, but could not be his partner. Noticing the surprised expression on his face, the brunette's older brother intervened and asked their mother to stop behaving in such a manner, as it was clearly uncomfortable for the guest. While the man distracted his mother, he also asked the protagonist to go to the younger brother's room, who was already waiting for his friend. Ascending to the second floor, Do-hyun noticed his secret love selecting a book that the two young men would read before sleep. However, as soon as the brunette noticed the young man, he immediately abandoned his task to go to sleep, confessing that he had been unable to sleep for several days and needed rest. Once in the bedroom, the man lay on the bed and beckoned the protagonist to join him. Such actions from his friend perplexed the dark-haired man, but nevertheless, he willingly agreed. Subsequently, Dongwook passed a book to the blue-eyed man that was meant to interest him. Moments later, he embraced the young man to fall asleep. Do-hyun appreciated the situation, as from the outside, it might appear that there was a more personal relationship between the two young men beyond mere friendship. Despite the joyful moment, the dark-haired man recalled the unpleasant truth. His best friend had never shown interest in the same sex. Their armored vehicles, shielded by the same type of shielding they deployed on their warships, rendering even our most powerful anti-armored batteries next to useless. Unexpectedly, the brunette demanded not to be left alone until he had rested well. The blue-eyed man agreed with a smile. The protagonist's parents had died before he was born. A few days before the birth, they were involved in an accident from which only the child survived. For a while, Do-hyun was cared for by his grandfather, who also passed away in the early years of his grandson's life. After a series of tragedies, Do-hyun came under the guardianship of his uncle. Nearby lived his secret love, whom he had met as a child. During that period, the brunette suffered from insomnia, but it was discovered that in the presence of the blue-eyed man, he could sleep soundly. From that point on, the boys developed a stronger friendship, as Dongwook seemed to physically need the protagonist's presence. According to childhood stories, he could not sleep properly because he saw a ghost. Reflecting on this now, the dark-haired man was grateful to the non-existent entity for the chance to befriend his beloved. While his secret love, Do-hyun, slept, he would stroke his head, contemplating how he dreamt of always being by his side. A few days later, the protagonist met an acquaintance who suggested he go on a blind date with someone of the same orientation and gender. Although the young man tried to refuse and Seungju insisted, believing it necessary to break the strong bond between the two friends. As the blue-eyed man expressed his lack of interest in new acquaintances, asserting his love for a man, the blonde explained that it was time to let go of unrequited feelings and move on. Despite the validity of these words, Do-hyun was reluctant to agree with them because his love for the man was too strong. During the conversation, Seungju wanted to smoke, but he had no lighter. Unexpectedly, the dark-haired man gave him his own, although he did not share the harmful habit. In the past, the brunette had personally gifted it to the young man on his birthday, and although it seemed as if he was indifferent to his friend's celebration, the recipient was happy to receive the gift. Since then, the blue-eyed man has carried the item everywhere with him. While the guys were talking, they noticed a man walking nearby with his latest girlfriend. Seungju used the situation to demonstrate his friend's character to the young man and also to persuade him to go on the blind date instead of indulging in his secret love. As soon as the group met with Dongwook and his companion, she whispered something peculiar into his ear. The next moment, the girl hurried to approach and greet the protagonist as if she knew him personally. He responded timidly, having never seen her before. Nevertheless, the man's companion behaved boldly and even audaciously towards his friend. Initially, she complimented the dark-haired man and then began to touch him without asking. Unexpectedly, Do-hyun's secret love intervened. He called the young man attractive and agreed with everything the girl had said earlier. Such behavior from the brunette surprised everyone, especially the protagonist, who was embarrassed by what he heard from his beloved. However, once the two friends were alone, the blonde once again reminded the dark-haired man that he needed to pursue genuine romantic relationships and forget his unrequited feelings for his friend. That evening, Do-hyun contemplated that he would be compelled to go on a blind date, as despite his refusals, his acquaintance had persuaded him. Moreover, Seungju not only convinced him of the necessity, but also set the time and place for the meeting with the potential future partner. Unexpectedly, the blue-eyed man's reflections were disturbed by the arrival of the brunette, who had climbed in through the window. The first thing his friend did was ask about what was happening in the protagonist's life, as he could see that he was distressed. Although the young man was touched by the concern, initially, he did not confess the reason for his worry. Only after a penetrating look from his beloved did Do-hyun reveal that he had been persuaded to go on a romantic encounter with someone else. This news greatly angered the man, and he unconsciously demonstrated his protest. Despite this, the protagonist was compelled to explain the situation in more detail. He confessed that he was being forced to date because he was always alone. Dongwook was perplexed upon hearing this, knowing well that the dark-haired man had little interest in relationships with women. Although he was correct, the blue-eyed man could not confess his true orientation. For this reason, he was compelled to fabricate a preference for a certain type of person. Naturally, his friend decided to inquire further about it. The protagonist was flustered, as he had never been attracted to the opposite sex. Thus, without much thought, he decided to describe his beloved, albeit transforming him into a female character in his narrative. While describing certain features of the brunette, the young man tried to do so as if speaking about someone else, and surprisingly, he succeeded, as the man believed him. The next moment, Dong-wook began to dispute what he heard, believing that such ideal criteria could not possibly match any real person. Nonetheless, the blue-eyed man held a different opinion, which irritated his friend. Unexpectedly, the brunette even decided to leave the other's bedroom. Before saying goodbye, Do-hyun's secret love suddenly paused, as if reconsidering. Instead, he decided to ask for something more personal. Moments later, the man declared that he wanted to sleep together with the protagonist. Without giving him a choice, the brunette led him to the bed. Naturally, the dark-haired man began to resist, as his bed was significantly smaller than his friend's, making it cramped for two. Nevertheless, as soon as Dong-wook heard the refusal, he suspected something was amiss. Mistakenly, he assumed that the man didn't want to share his room because he planned to bring a girl there in the future. Of course, this was not the case, but the young man could not reveal the truth, so he merely denied the other's assumptions. This frustrated his friend, who unexpectedly pinned him to the bed. With tears in his eyes, Do-hyun explained that there wouldn't be enough space for both of them. But his beloved not only disbelieved him, but also attempted to refute the information he had heard. The next moment, Dong-wook attempted to inquire about the person his friend had just described. The man felt that such a precise description must pertain to someone specific. Indeed, it did, but the dark-haired man could not admit this. Trying to uncover the truth, the brunette speculated that his current girlfriend might be the one the protagonist was talking about. Do-hyun was shocked by this suggestion, as he had never had any interest in someone else's partners. He tried to refute the assumption as quickly as possible. Nonetheless, an infuriated Dong-wook persisted, unable to understand why the identity of the earlier described individual was not being disclosed. Noticing his friend's anger, the young man hastened to calm him down. He sincerely confessed that he could never fall in love with the man's girlfriend. Mentally, the dark-haired man continued, revealing his deep affection for the very person he was speaking to, who mattered more to him than anyone else in the world. It seemed that the man believed what he heard, and instead of further jealousy, he began to inquire why he couldn't sleep together with Do-hyun. With astonishment on his face, the blue-eyed man repeated the same answer. His bed was too small for the two of them. Soon, the brunette left the room, still unconvinced. As soon as he had gone, the dark-haired man began to reflect on the overly close contact between them. He realized that the true reason for his refusal was that he might not be able to restrain his own romantic feelings. Continuing his contemplation, the young man suddenly decided to rid himself of the excess emotions that had overwhelmed him in the moment. The next morning, as the dark-haired man discussed the upcoming blind date with his acquaintance, Dong-wook intervened in the conversation. He was quite displeased with what he heard, as it was clear that he opposed the blue-eyed man entering into a relationship with anyone else. Not hiding his own anger, he sought clarification about the planned meeting. Instead of Do-hyun, the blonde answered all the questions, as he was more assertive. Seungju explained that the protagonist was a mature individual and therefore needed to initiate a relationship as soon as possible. Unexpectedly, the young man intervened in the dialogue, stating that the date would not interfere with their regular weekend sleepovers. It seemed that the dark-haired man thought his secret love's negative attitude was provoked by a potential disruption to his comfortable sleep routine, so he tried to reassure him. However, the acquaintance began to scold the brunette for even requiring such help from another person, clearly indicating that it could be inconvenient for him. Having heard all the arguments, Dong-wook suddenly declared that a guy like his best friend simply couldn't have a girlfriend. The beloved's words horrified the blue-eyed man, as they sounded like an insult. Not only was the dark-haired man shocked by what he heard, but Seungju was also taken aback and immediately began to yell at the man, finding it unacceptable to say such things to a close friend. Do-hyun interrupted the others with his statement that he didn't care about the brunette's words, and furthermore, his personal life shouldn't concern anyone. Now, what he heard displeased Dong-wook, as it somewhat offended him morally. Without much thought, he approached the protagonist to discuss everything in more detail. At that moment, the young man honestly confessed that he had no plans to enter into a relationship with anyone, so there was no cause for concern. This response was more satisfying to the man, but it also surprised him because if Do-hyun had no plans to pair up, then there was no need for him to go on the date. The conversation between the two young men was interrupted by the brunette's girlfriend, forcing them to say goodbye. Before parting, the friend asked about the planned sleepover that weekend. The blue-eyed man agreed to come, even earlier than usual. Only after the conversation ended did the blonde express his indignation about the situation. He disliked the unfairness shown by Dongwook. Despite the fact that Do-hyun's secret love was constantly in relationships with others, he explicitly forbade the dark-haired man from having one. Clearly, this fact also upset the young man, but he did not admit it, as he was willing to endure any harshness from his beloved. That's why he asked his acquaintance to stop scolding the brunette's behavior and not to interfere in what was happening between them. At night, the blue-eyed man reflected on the day's events, understanding that he had greatly angered Dongwook with his behavior. Nevertheless, he did not know the reasons for this, as he had done nothing wrong. Looking at his body after the shower, the young man admitted that he looked unremarkable compared to his friend's current girlfriend. Sadly, he realized that he had no chance of being with the one who truly mattered to him. A little later, Do-hyun received a call from a colleague. He asked the young man to come to the establishment where he worked immediately, as two of his friends were about to start a fight. The protagonist hurried to the cafe to help prevent a brawl between two people close to him. By the time he arrived, Dongwook was already swinging a broken bottle at the blonde. It was evident that the conflict between the two men was intensely serious. Fortunately, the dark-haired man arrived just in time to stop his beloved's dangerous attack on the acquaintance by embracing him. Surprisingly, Seongju asked the blue-eyed man to step aside and not interfere. Naturally, the young man did not comply. Instead, he vehemently demanded that the blonde leave immediately. Despite the sensibility of the protagonist's request, the acquaintance did not intend to heed it due to his own anger towards the object of his secret love. The man's volatile nature irritated him. For this reason, without much thought, Seongju pushed Do-hyun aside and continued the altercation with the brunette. He demanded that he stop interfering so obsessively in the dark-haired man's life and spoiling it with his prohibitions. Just as the argument was about to escalate further, the young man once again tried to prevent it by promising his beloved that they could spend the night together if he ended the dispute. Immediately after hearing this, the man discarded the bottle he had intended to use as a weapon and decided to go home with his friend. Although the dangerous situation had passed, the protagonist admitted that he could not simply leave. First, he wanted to compensate the establishment for the damages. As he was about to do so, the cafe employees asked him to forget about the expenses and simply remove Dongwook as quickly as possible. Hearing this, the dark-haired man froze, unable to imagine that everyone so strongly desired his beloved to stop causing fights. Noticing the reaction of others, the man offered to carry the blue-eyed man if he was unwilling or unable to walk. Of course, the embarrassed young man declined the offer, and soon after, the two young men left the establishment and took a taxi home. On the way, the object of the protagonist's secret love slept on his shoulder, while he himself contemplated the upcoming night together with his beloved. Although such instances had occurred before following a series of personal moments between the friends, Do-hyun could not stop himself from reacting emotionally. Upon arriving at the house, the young man stated that he would first inform his uncle of his plans before coming over to the brunette's place for the night. Initially, this arrangement did not completely satisfy Dongwook, as he still wished to spend the night in the protagonist's room. However, he soon found himself compelled to agree to all of the blue-eyed man's conditions and went home to wait for him. Finally, he imposed a time limit on his friend to hasten his arrival. Otherwise, his desire to be in Do-hyun's bed would be fulfilled. Shortly after, the young man was already in the man's bedroom, having arrived on time because he was genuinely concerned about the conditions set. As he settled into the brunette's bed, the blue-eyed man inquired why he was so eager to sleep in his room. Embracing his friend tightly, the object of his secret love ignored the question, as he was very sleepy. Nonetheless, he soon initiated a conversation again, this time about the blind date. Dongwook reminded the protagonist of the ideal physical type he had described earlier, and added that he had learned from Seongju at the cafe that such a person was already interested in the dark-haired man. This revelation surprised the young man, as he had no idea who was actually being referred to. Yet he confessed again that he had no plans to enter into a relationship, and if he did, he would first inform the brunette. Do-hyun's words displeased the man, as they seemed somewhat contradictory. He became angry again, desperately unwilling to accept the possibility that the blue-eyed man might find a partner. Then, the protagonist explained that although he did not desire it, there was a small chance that he might one day be in a relationship. Completely disregarding all the dark-haired man's arguments, Dongwook personally concluded that his friend already had a beloved, and thus began to inquire about it. The young man was disconcerted by this, as he could not even imagine himself in a relationship with anyone, particularly involving tactile interactions and other romantic gestures. Despite this, he ignored his beloved's question and suggested they simply go to sleep. The two young men did just that. The next morning, as the protagonist was planning to leave the house, the brunette's mother stopped him. She expressed her regret at having to say goodbye so soon. The dark-haired man was clearly pleased to learn that his secret love's family held him in high regard, yet he still hastened to depart. The previous night, while they were supposed to be sleeping, the blue-eyed man couldn't fall asleep and instead gazed admiringly at his beloved's face, who was oblivious to his scrutiny. In that moment, he silently confessed his feelings for the man and dreamed of kissing him at least once. He refrained, however, fearing the revelation of his feelings. Ultimately, it was then that Do-hyun finally understood the blonde's advice and realized that he needed to relinquish his unrequited feelings for the brunette. He now attempted to figure out how to do just that. Unfortunately, the blue-eyed man found himself without options and broke down in tears. At that moment, unexpectedly, his phone rang. His beloved friend was calling him again. When the protagonist answered, he immediately sensed something was amiss. He could tell from the dark-haired man's voice that he was feeling unwell. Despite this, Do-hyun tried to assure him that everything was fine. Soon, the two young men were to meet again, and just the thought of it made the blue-eyed man unusually nervous. A bit later, as he was on his way to meet Dong-wook, the latter unexpectedly encountered him near the subway, claiming the meeting was coincidental rather than a deliberate act of care. The protagonist overlooked the oddities and even believed what he heard. Afterwards, the two young men began discussing Do-hyun's tutoring. The blue-eyed man smiled and confessed that his student was grasping the material very well. Although he was pleased to share this news, he suddenly remembered that he had never mentioned this side job to his friend. Surprised that the brunette knew about it at all, the young man decided to inquire further. Unexpectedly, the man explained that although no one had told him directly, he had overheard the blue-eyed man discussing it with the blonde. It seemed that Dong-wook was angry with his best friend, but tried to contain his emotions. Shortly after, the two young men entered the house together. Once again, the beloved's mother greeted the young man at the doorstep, as usual expressing that she would be delighted to have someone like him as a daughter-in-law. However, this time, the brunette himself decided to respond to what he heard. He candidly suggested his relative consider the dark-haired man as a potential partner for her son. This proposal greatly shocked the woman and horrified the protagonist, as neither of them expected such a jest. Nevertheless, the next moment, Dong-wook made it clear to everyone that he was serious. Consequently, he forcibly pulled the blue-eyed man into his bedroom. As they ascended to the room, he requested that no family members enter. Naturally, this statement surprised everyone as much as the previous one. While the man's mother was concerned, the older brother, on the other hand, tried to defuse the situation. He convinced the woman not to meddle in others' affairs, arguing that Do-hyun posed no threat. Meanwhile, the two young men continued on their way to the bedroom. The object of the protagonist's secret love stated that he would carry him if he refused to walk on his own. Once alone in the brunette's room, the two young men sat in silence for some time. The dark-haired man felt unmistakably awkward after the events that had transpired. Dong-wook decided to break the silence himself and asked something significant. He wanted to know why his best friend had not told him about his orientation. The question terrified the young man, as his greatest fear was that his beloved would discover this secret. Realizing what was happening, he immediately attempted to flee. Unfortunately, the man quickly caught him in his embrace. Only then did the blue-eyed man inquire how the brunette had learned the truth about him. Naturally, the blonde was the culprit. Although Dong-wook did not admit it, it was clear that the acquaintance was the only suspect. In the midst of discussing this, the object of Do-hyun's secret love suddenly kissed him. Immediately afterward, the man displayed his jealousy towards Seungju. He disliked how much the dark-haired man talked about and with him. The protagonist was greatly flustered by what he heard and suggested they discuss it. However, he was ignored, as the brunette had already pushed him onto the bed. Instead of talking, Dong-wook announced that he intended to do more with his friend than just talk. Moments later, he kissed the dark-haired man again, this time more intensely. Surprisingly, Do-hyun was not pleased with what was happening. On the contrary, his feelings were hurt by the man's actions. Although he found the kisses and touches from the brunette pleasant, he realized that things were not as simple as they might seem. Unexpectedly, Dong-wook asked the blue-eyed man whether he had ever kissed anyone before. Naturally, the embarrassed dark-haired man's response was negative. For this reason, the object of the protagonist's secret love decided to teach him how to kiss himself. He explained the details and even demonstrated them in practice. During the process, the man was astonished that the dark-haired man did not resist or push him away. This fact led him to believe that he was permitted to do anything. However, it soon became apparent that he was mistaken, as once Do-hyun realized his friend's intentions, he instantly got up from the bed and hurried away. This behavior shocked Dong-wook, as he clearly did not expect the young man to reject him. Soon, the dark-haired man prepared to go on a blind date, as he had previously promised a friend. Despite feeling upset after the incident with his beloved, the protagonist could not stay angry with him. Instead, he pondered what might have happened if he hadn't fled. Trying not to dwell on it, Do-hyun arrived at the designated meeting place for his date with his potential future partner. Upon seeing the man who came for the date, the young man was stunned because it turned out to be Seungju. Initially, the blue-eyed man thought his real date hadn't shown up, but it soon emerged that the whole arrangement had been orchestrated by the blonde, who genuinely wanted to be with him. It seemed the acquaintance was ready to demonstrate his sincere intentions, even going so far as to introduce himself anew to the protagonist. Of course, the young man took it as a joke, but as it turned out, Seungju was serious. He admitted his attraction to the dark-haired man and proposed that they start dating. This information greatly shocked the blue-eyed man, as he clearly remembered that both of his friends were not known to be of non-traditional orientations. In response, the blonde tried to communicate his bisexuality and elaborate on his special feelings for Do-hyun. After listening to everything and reflecting for a moment, the dark-haired man decided how to respond. With evident resentment, he explained that he did not want to be a plaything for his friends and thus would not allow them to experiment with personal contact with him. The blue-eyed man perceived Seungju's proposal as a jest and possibly an attempt to pity his solitary nature. Therefore, he was very negatively disposed. After Shimu pondered for a moment, he walked to the wooden frame and took off the long knife again. After a moment, sword shadows erupted in the square, like flying sand and rocks, or like dragons emerging from the sea. Nonetheless, the young man did not plan to change his decision about this, and thus, even after listening, continued to be angry with both of his friends. That is why, in the next moment, instead of calmly responding to the proposal to date, the dark-haired man responded with his request to end the friendship with the blonde forever. After trying to end the conversation with Seungju, the protagonist hastened to leave. Just as he was exiting the venue, the acquaintance stopped him to find out why he couldn't become a true partner to Do-hyun. The man was angry about the rejection, remembering that Do-hyun had feelings for his best friend, and thus he was confident that he could also captivate him. Although the blue-eyed man had never spoken of his infatuation with the brunette, the blonde had discerned everything when he noticed Do-hyun's gaze on the object of his secret affection. Moreover, although Seungju initially found the idea of a romantic relationship with another man strange, after observing the charming dark-haired man for a while, he noticed something alluring about him. Initially, the blonde treated the protagonist superficially and even compared him to a girl. But after getting to know him better, he unwittingly fell in love with him. He first became aware of his feelings during a basketball game when he noticed the blue-eyed man's height and then observed other features of his appearance. Soon, the blonde realized that despite his delicate appearance, the young man was considerably stronger than him personally. This unique detail made him special to him. The more Seungju observed the protagonist, the more he grew fond of him. The dark-haired man's good grades, gentle nature, and diligence intrigued him. When his positive opinion about Do-hyun filled all of the blonde's thoughts, he realized that he was truly in love with his acquaintance. Since then, the man had dreamed of confessing his feelings and starting a relationship with the blue-eyed man. As he pondered this, the young man suddenly announced that he was joining the army, and therefore further communication between them was pointless. This statement shocked Seungju. Initially, he did not believe this information, but soon, noticing the seriousness of his interlocutor, he was convinced of its truth. Only upon reflecting did the blonde suddenly realize that he knew absolutely nothing personal about the dark-haired man. He was unaware of his hobbies or life plans. Despite this, he was resolute about his feelings and believed in their sincerity. Therefore, as Do-hyun was about to leave, the man confessed his feelings to him again. Without giving a definitive response, the protagonist hurried to permanently leave the acquaintance's company. Late in the evening, the blue-eyed man sat alone in the establishment, nursing a drink. His thoughts were consumed by the events of the day. As he reflected, He realized that his feelings had been hurt by the blonde's blunt statements about his bisexuality and his capacity to date even those he did not favor. What pained the dark-haired man most was the realization that his beloved shared the same life principles as Seungju, which infuriated him. Every time he talked about this mid-level acquired warrior still felt extremely regretful. For Shimu, with his current small net worth, there is no need to think about purchasing auxiliary elixirs. The man then led Do-hyun outside and began reproaching him for the amount he had consumed with evident dismay. While the object of the young man's secret love attempted to scold him, he himself muttered something indistinct about his reflections on what had happened earlier. The blue-eyed man's emotions fluctuated between sorrow and joy, likely due to the alcohol consumed. Mentally, he suddenly admitted to himself that he had never considered Dongwook a bad person. In that moment, he smiled and kissed his beloved spontaneously, greatly shocking him. Without hesitation, the brunette reciprocated the kiss, and now both friends were astonished by each other's behavior. Shortly thereafter, ceasing their personal actions, the man led his friend to a motel, evidently to continue what had started on the street. There, he earnestly requested that the dark-haired man never push him away again or forbid him to act as he wished. It seemed that the object of the protagonist's secret love was resolutely intent on achieving something more that night from his best friend. Although the protagonist attempted to explain his behavior earlier, the man did not allow him to finish, cutting him off with a kiss. Not wanting to waste time, Dongwook decided to proceed with the main agenda, for which he had brought the young man to the motel that evening. The brunette was astounded by the behavior of his beloved, who was far more uninhibited than he could have ever imagined. Before the brunette could act, Do-hyun tried to protest, but failed as his object of secret affection was unwavering. Without fully understanding the earlier situation, the two young men began the process. Before starting, the man requested another personal kiss from the protagonist, instead of dwelling on any doubts or worries that might exist between them. He complied. Only after this tactile gesture did the young man try in earnest to refuse continuing, but of course, once again he was unsuccessful, because his friend thought the brunette was simply too embarrassed by what was happening. However, it soon became clear that Dongwook was mistaken. After an instance of personal contact, the blue-eyed man began to cry. He started expressing all his negative emotions to the brunette, accusing him of being as rough towards him and his feelings as Seungju had been previously. As soon as the man realized he was being compared to the blonde, he became angry. He did not want to hear such words from the person with whom he intended to spend the night. Feeling jealousy, Dongwook tried to inquire about what exactly their mutual acquaintance had done in the past. However, despite his friend's attempts, the protagonist did not disclose all the details. He merely laughed briefly, then began to ask his own questions, which, it seemed, had long been troubling him personally. Do-hyun wanted to know why his friends had suddenly become interested in members of their own sex. Baffled by the question, the brunette momentarily froze, unsure of how to respond. In the next instant, he suggested they discuss this matter after they had engaged in personal contact. This proposal once again made the young man laugh, which seemed to deeply upset him. It appeared that the laughter profoundly affected him, hinting at his considerable distress. Nevertheless, the object of the protagonist's secret affection intended to continue the process. The man firmly announced that he would commence the main action immediately, unless the young man objected. In response to this declaration, Do-hyun merely remained silent, and thus the two young men proceeded. During the subsequent process, the brunette repeatedly tried to call out to the brunette, but he merely ignored him. Such detached behavior from the protagonist forced Dongwook to stop once again. Now, he wanted to know why earlier on the street, the blue-eyed man had kissed him of his own accord. Despite his best friend's demands for an immediate response, the young man decided to act just as his beloved had done previously. For this reason, in the next moment, he announced that he would not discuss anything until their close contact ended. However, such antics did not resolve the situation, as the brunette persistently continued to ask, obviously still seeking an explanation from the brunette. The blue-eyed man gave in and justified the incident on the street by having had too much to drink and having been preoccupied with thoughts about a recent kiss with another man. This response seemed to satisfy Dongwook, who then inquired again about what had transpired between the protagonist and the blonde earlier. Do-hyun reluctantly lied that the acquaintance had merely made an ill-timed joke at his expense, leading to their quarrel. Mentally, he realized that he had been too categorical in his judgment and that it would be better to call and apologize. The conversation about the third party was distinctly displeasing to the brunette, who was evidently feeling jealousy and confusion due to the suddenly uncomfortable topic of the conversation. As soon as the young man heard of his indignation, He admitted to himself that he felt the same way towards his friend and his partners. In the course of further actions, the blue-eyed man suddenly realized that he was not of any physiological interest to his beloved, which made him think that going to the motel with him had been a mistake. Distracted by these thoughts, Do-hyun visibly became dejected. As soon as the brunette noticed this, he became even more anxious than before, and thus began to inquire even more about the situation with the blonde, believing him to be at fault for what had happened. The protagonist, evidently unwilling to respond to his best friend, merely tried to dodge a direct account by using oblique words. However, this only angered Dong-wook more, who could clearly tell when the blue-eyed man was lying to him. He frankly informed the young man of this. The brunette was lost in his thoughts about how his beloved had always shown understanding towards his behavior. Now, it seemed to him that he was being treated just like everyone else. This peculiar situation further upset Do-hyun, which the object of his secret affection noticed. Therefore, in the next moment, the man attempted to test his suspicions with a kiss. Once he was certain that the blue-eyed man definitely did not want to continue their close contact, he stopped. Soon, the brunette declared that this time he could restrain his own desires towards his friend, but next time, he might not. The words struck the protagonist deeply, as he had long contemplated the unpleasant moments that had just occurred between them. Now, after seeing the man's reaction, he personally decided to propose that they engage in personal actions together. Although the young man spoke this during a moment of tears, the brunette believed in the sincerity of the statement. That is why he leaned in again to kiss the brunette. Since it was excessively difficult for Dong-wook to restrain his own desires and feelings, he decided to partially fulfill his intentions. Now, Do-hyun did not object to this. At the end of the encounter between the two young men, the protagonist nearly confessed his romantic feelings for his best friend. But he stopped his words at the very last and most crucial word, astonishing the brunette completely. Naturally, the man tried to clarify the information that remained unsaid, as he obviously guessed what the young man had intended to say. Nevertheless, the brunette continued to speak unclearly and evasively, thus not fully explaining the words spoken earlier. It seemed that the brunette was not saddened by this, for without waiting for the full confession, he kissed his friend. As Dong-wook's mood improved significantly from before, he wanted to continue the personal process with the protagonist. Unfortunately, it was to no avail, as the blue-eyed man had fallen asleep. Despite the unexpected turn of events, Do-hyun decided there was no need to rush into discussing the romantic feelings between them, as there would be plenty of time for that. After kissing the sleeping young man goodnight, the man drifted off to sleep himself. Later, when the protagonist awoke, he sobered up from the alcohol he had consumed earlier and was horrified by the situation in which he had inadvertently found himself. Realizing that he was in the same bed fully naked with the person he loved, he also partially recalled what had transpired between them earlier. With evident bewilderment and confusion, the blue-eyed man headed to the shower to collect his thoughts and ponder everything that had happened. He could hardly believe that he had almost confessed his feelings to Dong-wook earlier. Only during his reflections did Do-hyun finally manage to remember everything, from the kiss on the street to the personal actions between him and his friend. Naturally, realizing all that had occurred prompted the brunette to flee the motel as quickly as possible. At that moment, the man was not asleep but merely pretending. As soon as the protagonist left, the brunette opened his eyes and smiled, reasoning that the blue-eyed needed more time to contemplate his feelings for him. Dong-wook was almost certain that the young man would come to the realization of the need for a more personal conversation about their feelings on his own. Moreover, he was convinced that there was plenty of time for this, and therefore he was not worried at all. Later, the brunette reflected on the protagonist's earlier initiative on the street. As the object of Do-hyun's secret affection, he had not expected such actions from him and was now pleasantly surprised. In pondering the situation that had occurred earlier, the brunette once again confirmed that he genuinely liked his best friend. As it turned out, he had suspected this for a long time. Having come to this realization, the man contemplated how he desired to have the brunette completely for himself, not just as a close person, but also as a lover. Soon, as Dong-wook headed to the shower, he thought about his special feelings for the young man due to the romantic affection he harbored for him. Furthermore, he admitted to himself that he knew no one he valued more than the protagonist. Clearly, the man loved the brunette as deeply as he was loved in return. As it turned out, the object of Do-hyun's secret affection had been patiently waiting for a long time to disclose his reciprocal interest. When Dong-wook first learned about his best friend's taste preferences, he was shocked, as he had never imagined such a thing before. Nevertheless, over time, he became accustomed to the idea and even decided to observe the young man for a while to better understand his orientation and feelings. At that very moment, unbeknownst to himself, the brunette unconsciously fell in love with the protagonist. Since their high school days, the object of Do-hyun's secret affection had been aware of his friend's fondness for him and had even shown an interest in him personally. During their school days, on one sunny day, the two young men played basketball together. While pondering that it would be difficult to defeat the brunette in the game, he inadvertently noticed how a mutual acquaintance was being overly familiar with the young man. Naturally, what he saw angered the brunette, who not only suspected his best friend's feelings for him, but also harbored similar sentiments. Consequently, Dong-wook spent some time watching with confusion and irritation the acquaintance's actions toward the young man, and inwardly chastised Do-hyun for allowing strangers to touch him. Even though the young men were merely fooling around, he decided to intervene in the situation to put an end to their overly intimate interaction. To do this, the man approached them to join in the game. Nevertheless, the acquaintance had no intention of stopping, and even at that moment began to whisper something secretively into the brunette's ear. Naturally, such antics by a stranger only infuriated Dong-wook more. For this reason, he struggled to control his emotions and unwittingly shouted and snapped at his best friend's acquaintance. Eventually, the group of young men decided to play basketball together. Although the brunette had previously doubted his ability to defeat Do-hyun, once the match began, he confidently started to prevail. Thus, the man sought to demonstrate his capabilities to the protagonist and to prove that he was the best in his circle. After scoring another basket, the object of the blue-eyed man's secret affection proudly turned to gauge his reaction. In that moment, the young man watched him with sheer delight, inadvertently causing his friend to blush. It seems that this moment was the first when the brunette realized his romantic feelings towards the brunette. Having won the game, the man suggested they go home together. Do-hyun, appearing even happier than the victor, smilingly agreed. Now, as they walked through the city towards home, the brunette fondly recalled that past moment, which had prompted him to recognize his own feelings and reconsider his relationship with his best friend. Contemplating all aspects of his relationship with the protagonist, the man was certain that soon their bond would become much stronger and closer than mere friendship. Although he had allowed the blue-eyed man to leave the motel and himself that day, by tomorrow, Dong-wook planned to secure what he desired most, a beloved who would never leave him. Unexpectedly, the man's reflections were interrupted by a phone call from an ex-girlfriend. She was angry with him for their abrupt breakup and wanted to discuss everything in detail, including the possibility of rekindling their relationship. Nevertheless, the brunette had no desire to listen to her, much less discuss anything further. For this reason, without much thought, he was brusque with his former partner and bluntly informed her that their interaction was over, as he now had interest only in his best friend. Soon after, Dong-wook finally returned home. His mother greeted him with surprise, assuming the protagonist would also come along. When the brunette explained that this was not the case, she was astonished. The woman knew that the brunette was due to enlist in the army the next day, and thus could not understand how her son could be so calm. Nevertheless, the mother did not express her concerns directly to her younger child, but instead discussed the situation with her elder son. Since Do-hyun's mother regarded him as her own child, she resolved to personally ensure that the young man did not feel abandoned on his departure day. For this reason, the concerned woman decided to discuss with her son a list of items and provisions that should be given to the blue-eyed young man for his journey. She knew that surviving a year and a half away from family and friends would not be easy, and thus she wanted to provide all the support she could. Naturally, she was also worried about Dong-wook's well-being, knowing he couldn't sleep well without the blue-eyed man. The elder son tried to reassure his mother and explained that it was quite normal for even friends to be apart sometimes. The woman, already saddened by the events, tried to grasp the reality of the situation. Unexpectedly, she decided to inquire about the actual nature of the relationship between the two young men. The eldest child explained that he was unsure, as the dynamics between Do-hyun and the brunette were so volatile and intense that it seemed even they could not define their relationship. Since it was the man's father who had helped the brunette enlist in the army, the mother had previously tried to resolve the situation on her own and dissuade her husband from agreeing to such a decision. However, her attempts were unsuccessful due to the protagonist's cunning, increasing her anxiety about the situation. Unexpectedly, Dong-wook, who had entered the kitchen and accidentally overheard the conversation between the two relatives, intervened. After discussing some details, the man learned that his beloved would be leaving him for a long time as early as tomorrow. Naturally, he was horrified by this information, as it seemed that everyone except him knew about the young man's departure to the army. Once the others realized this, they too were shocked by the revelation. The brunette, stunned by such news, realized that all his plans and hopes for the future were shattered in an instant. Moreover, he might not even have a chance to say goodbye to Do-hyun, who was leaving for a year and a half. The next morning, fully prepared for his military departure, the protagonist awaited his bus. Arriving on time, he appeared content, a rare moment of peace amidst the chaos. Despite the many other young men also leaving for service, the brunette stood alone. No one had come to see him off. While the relatives and friends of others wept and embraced the future soldiers, the blue-eyed young man stood silently by himself. Mentally, Do-hyun admitted to himself that despite all his efforts to join the army, he had still not come to terms with how profoundly his life would change that very day. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a familiar silhouette in the crowd, resembling his best friend. Moments later, it was clear it truly was him. The blue-eyed man was jolted by astonishment and terror upon realizing that his beloved had indeed learned of his departure and had come to see him off in person. Initially, the brunette seemed deeply upset by the unfolding events, but as he drew closer to his best friend, he began to voice his strong disapproval of what was happening. Visibly enraged, Dong-wook clenched his fists as if he were about to strike the brunette. However, apart from hurling hurtful words in his distress, he refrained from any physical action. Rather than seeking a confrontation, the object of the protagonist's secret affection inquired why he had decided to leave so abruptly after what had transpired at the motel. The blue-eyed man was so overwhelmed by the encounter that he completely ignored all his lover's words, lost in thoughts about his previous belief that he would never see him again. For many years, the young man had concealed his romantic feelings for his best friend, naively thinking it would be enough to simply be near him. Yet, having once allowed himself a kiss on the street, he realized he was in a complex situation, desiring more but unable to permit himself that luxury. Ultimately, the brunette acknowledged that it would be better if he never saw Dong-wook again. Despite the agony this decision brought to the blue-eyed man, he knew it was the only right choice, as things simply could not continue as they were. After some contemplation, the protagonist decided to respond with a statement that the brunette would one day marry and start a family, and therefore, their overly intimate friendship should end. Furthermore, from now on, the man would need to find someone else with whom he could fall asleep, as it was inappropriate to continually do so with another man. This revelation completely shocked Dong-wook, as he had never planned on forming close relationships with others, believing that true happiness required only the blue-eyed man. In anger, the brunette declared that he had never desired to have a family and children, and his need for Do-hyun at night was in no way related to what had happened at the motel previously. The surprised young man then tried to clarify, suggesting that if the man was interested in women, what happened in the room should be forgotten. The object of the protagonist's secret affection confidently stated that he had never made any such claim about his orientation. In the next moment, the brunette bowed his head and rested it on the shoulder of his beloved. It seemed he was emotionally exhausted from trying to prove the truth about his feelings, which continually wounded the blue-eyed man. The two young men, secretly in love with each other, were struck by the unfolding events, as they both suffered from the unresolved issues in their communication. Caught in a complex situation, the protagonist was unsure how to proceed, as his feelings for the man were overwhelmingly strong and genuine. Unexpectedly, Dong-wook decided to delve deeper into this matter. He attempted to ascertain how serious their actions in the motel had been. The shocked brunette didn't know how to respond. At that moment, the brunette reflected on his recent musings about the past, as well as his earlier confidence that they had plenty of time to clarify details. Having always been inseparable since their youth, he couldn't imagine that one day their connection would end. He had unconditionally believed that they would be together forever, but now he realized how mistaken he had been. All this time, Dong-wook had patiently waited for the moment when the blue-eyed man would inevitably confess his romantic feelings. Now, finding himself in such a predicament, the man realized he had been overly naive. This realization brought him to tears, prompting the young man to comfort him. Do-hyun explained that he would never exploit his best friend for personal gain, and therefore what transpired between them in the motel was a genuine expression of his feelings. Hearing this, the man could only partially believe in his companion's sincerity, and thus he sought to understand what the protagonist truly felt for him. He speculated that it might be a moral attachment or a sense of gratitude for one family's help to another. The words of his beloved shocked the brunette. Naturally, he denied such notions and confessed that he bore no resentment towards his best friend. Now, Dongwook created a situation that encouraged the young man to declare his love. It seemed deliberate, as he soon asked directly. Since the brunette wanted to hear immediately about the protagonist's love for him, he persistently inquired about it. The bewildered brunette found himself unable to simply confess, and thus remained silent. Noticing his beloved's confusion, the man confessed that he was prepared to wait for his loved one to return from the army in a year and a half, provided that the blue-eyed man honestly shared his feelings. Pleading with him to finally open up, the object of his secret affection embraced him right on the street. Although the brunette understood that Dongwook had long known about his love, he still could not express it directly. With tears in his eyes, the blue-eyed man asked the brunette to wait just a little longer. He begged for 100 days to prepare himself for his own confession, promising to take leave from the service after this period. Surprisingly, the man responded with understanding and smilingly agreed to this request. At that moment, it was time for the protagonist to depart, so the two young men said their farewells. As Do-hyun left for the army in tears, his beloved resolved to live through these 100 days, fueled by his equally strong love. Although the two lovers had promised each other communication, it eventually turned out that one of them had not kept this promise. Previously, the man had eagerly planned to wait for the protagonist's leave from the army and personally meet him. However, on the appointed day, he received no call, which greatly angered the brunette. Moreover, when he tried to clarify details over the phone himself, his beloved unexpectedly began to reschedule their planned meeting. Naturally, Dongwook was upset by this news, as he had already patiently waited a full 100 days. Nonetheless, he was willing to accept the delay. But first, he wanted to understand the reasons. Unexpectedly, a friend of the brunette who was already drinking at a bar interrupted the conversation. Upon learning this, the man immediately headed to the cafe. Thus, the brunette found himself at a gathering, drinking with all his best friend's companions while the latter, seemingly forgetting his promise, enjoyed the evening. During their conversation, Do-hyun admitted that he had missed everyone immensely, despite the brief time that had passed. This discussion was echoed by others, and so one of the friends inquired whom the blue-eyed man had missed the most. As the young man pondered the question, the topic of the conversation shifted. One of the friends doubted the physical capabilities of the protagonist, who appeared extremely delicate and charming. This opinion greatly angered the others, including the love interest of the young man, as they all knew the brunette to be much stronger than he seemed. Do-hyun also candidly informed them of this, but the acquaintance remained skeptical. Moreover, in the next moment, he tried to explain why such a notion was impossible by personally insulting the physical characteristics of the brunette. Surprisingly, the blue-eyed man responded to the rudeness with a sincere smile and his own negative opinion. Nevertheless, the debate over the protagonist's physical abilities continued for a while until the guys decided to conduct arm wrestling trials to determine the truth. Thus, the entire company began competing in arm wrestling, with Do-hyun naturally becoming the main challenger. Only the brunette, watching everything from the sidelines, was extremely displeased with what was happening. During the so-called competition for the truth, the protagonist indeed managed to defeat all his friends except for his best friend. When it was time for the two to compete, the man approached the challenge with skepticism. He was confident in his victory, as the brunette had already exhausted his strength on the others. Nonetheless, he was also seriously determined. During the arm wrestling match, the brunette noticed how fiercely his friend truly wanted to win. He was amused by this, yet he had no intention of yielding and thus effortlessly triumphed over the blue-eyed man. This victory upset his friend, but he did not want to deceive him. Moreover, Dongwook was angry due to his beloved's attempt to break a past promise. Unexpectedly, the man's ex-girlfriend approached the group, wanting to speak with him privately. He reluctantly agreed and stepped aside. The protagonist, observing this, was once again upset by feelings of jealousy and resentment towards his best friend for his past relationships. As a result, he began to drink more alcohol unconsciously, quickly becoming heavily intoxicated. Eventually, when the man finished speaking with the woman, he was angry at his beloved for drinking excessively and intended to take him away from the gathering as soon as possible. Without much thought, he did just that. Soon, the two young men were together in a taxi. As before, the situation was awkward, but this time the blue-eyed man was the one creating the discomfort. Shortly after, the man woke his companion to inform him that they had finally arrived at the hotel. It seemed that Dongwook was seriously intent on ensuring the fulfillment of a promise previously made to him. Although the protagonist got out of the car, he was completely unaware of the reasons why they had come to a hotel instead of going straight home. As the brunette had sobered up while sleeping, he felt uneasy even thinking about what might happen between him and his love interest alone in a hotel room. Nevertheless, he agreed to go to the hotel. As they ascended to the required floor, the young man reflected on how he had almost forgotten about his beloved's affluent family. After all, not everyone could so easily afford to stay in a hotel every time. Upon entering the room, the blue-eyed man was struck by its appearance. As soon as the two young men were alone, the man quickly embraced Do-hyun from behind, clearly showing how much he had missed him. Only then did the brunette begin to inquire about the promise previously given, as the 100th day was almost over and he had not yet heard any confession. Understandably, the protagonist was apprehensive about starting this conversation and was quite embarrassed when it was brought up. Nevertheless, the blue-eyed man had to confess that he had been forced to meet with friends who had organized a party in his honor in advance. This information once again made Dong-wook feel jealous, but surprisingly, he restrained himself from expressing indignation and simply held the young man tighter. After a short while, the man asked about the nature of his best friend's relationship with the blonde. He was concerned that he might have a real rival for his feelings. The protagonist hurried to explain that there were no romantic relations between him and the acquaintance. It seemed that the brunette knew this, but reassured himself by forcing the brunette to respond directly. Once he received an answer, Dong-wook began to ambiguously touch the blue-eyed man's body, as if desiring to repeat what had happened earlier in the motel, or even more. Although Do-hyun tried to protest against doing anything too personal, the man explained that he already knew the young man would not fulfill his promise to disclose his feelings today. Therefore, he wanted to get something out of it. Overly embarrassed, the brunette suggested they discuss all the details after a shower. Although the brunette agreed to this, he warned that there would be no escape. Upon hearing this, the protagonist froze with obvious astonishment on his face. It seemed he had indeed planned to escape from his object of affection while he was showering. Now he was forced to sit still, waiting for the man to return. The young man was extremely uncomfortable and unsure how to proceed, as even after 100 days, he was still not emotionally prepared for a declaration of love. Meanwhile, as he showered, the brunette pondered the events that had just transpired. He was prepared to abandon all propriety to achieve his desires if his friend had not intervened. Given the lengthy wait, the man could scarcely think rationally. All he wanted was to have Do-hyun as his partner. When the object of the protagonist's affection returned from the shower, ready to continue their intimate interactions and serious conversation, he found that he had already fallen asleep. Naturally, this greatly shocked him, as he had planned numerous activities for that night. Now, the man was forced to simply lie down beside his friend. Previously, Dong-wook had struggled to sleep well without his beloved nearby, so now he was not opposed to this temporary resolution. A bit later, when the protagonist awoke, he was astonished that the brunette had allowed him just to sleep. He was touched by such apparent care. In the next moment, the blue-eyed man began to examine the face and body of the sleeping man beside him, as he looked exceedingly peaceful and attractive. At that moment, the protagonist realized that he could no longer perceive his beloved's appearance as before, as he no longer saw the brunette merely as a friend. Ever since the incident in the motel between the two young men, he could not stop thinking about certain physical characteristics of Dong-wook. Now, recalling details of the past and some events of the day, the brunette unconsciously began to fantasize about a more intimate relationship between them. Embarrassed by his own thoughts, the young man decided to take an immediate shower to calm down. However, once in the bathroom, the blue-eyed man was unable to stop the flow of personal thoughts. After a brief deliberation, he decided to address it in another way. As he satisfied his physical needs, the protagonist reminisced about various moments shared with his best friend. Eventually, he unexpectedly recalled their last conversation before his departure to the army. Afterwards, the young man mentally admitted to himself that his feelings for Dong-wook had intensified. Hence, now he was experiencing not only emotional pain. Moreover, whereas previously he could restrain his emotions, he was now unsure if it was indeed possible to continue doing so. Returning from the shower, Do-hyun looked at the face of his sleeping beloved and pondered the grim reality that true happiness between them might never be achievable due to the impossibility of their relationship. Although the object of the brunette's secret affection had once confessed his attraction, the blue-eyed man was convinced it wasn't serious. The young man believed that his own feelings were far stronger and more profound, as they had developed over many years. Suddenly, Do-hyun's reflections were interrupted by a call from a friend, urging him to return to the bar as soon as possible. The protagonist had already planned to do so, as he had no desire to stay in the room next to his beloved. Nonetheless, he was certain that the man would be furious upon waking up and finding him gone. Soon enough, this was exactly what happened. Upon awakening, Dong-wook was extremely angry and proceeded to upheave half of the items in the hotel room. It was only later that he noticed the young man had accidentally left behind his travel bag. Therefore, the brunettes' first action was to call and directly inquire about his beloved's whereabouts. Upon learning all the details, he was stunned to realize that no one at the bar was actually expecting him. On the contrary, it seemed that even Do-hyun himself did not want his best friend to come. Although the object of the young man's secret affection thought he was intentionally avoiding him, this was not the case. In reality, the blue-eyed man had other reasons for speaking so negatively about the meeting, which the brunette never learned, yet he promised to come right away. Meanwhile, at the cafe, the man's ex-girlfriend was crying and complaining to others about his excessively harsh behavior towards her. It appeared that a whole group of friends was consoling the distressed woman, while she, in turn, insulted and verbally demeaned Dongwook. Although the protagonist was accustomed to such behavior from many years of friendship, after the recent events between him and the brunette, he felt uncomfortable being present. Clearly, Do-hyun did not want to complicate the situation with the man's unplanned arrival, even though he mentally admitted to himself that he longed to see him again.